Well, greetings, brethren. Happy Sabbath to all of you. Lovely to see you. It's nice to have visitors as well, and also nice to have the Hostons back. Although not all of them are back. We'll see them again next week, I guess. So, anyway, tonight at sunset through tomorrow at sunset is Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is a Jewish fast day, a full day fast. A lot of the other fasts they have are usually like from morning to sunset, but this is a full day fast from sunset to sunset. Memorializes the temple's destruction because amazingly, both temples, the Temple of Solomon at the time of the Babylonian invasion, and later the rebuilt temple of Herod at the time of the Roman invasion, they were both destroyed at the same time. There's some debate about exactly how the days fell, and we look at that, but it does seem that it was very close, and maybe it was exactly on the 9th of Av. I think in the latter case, it may be that the fire started on the 9th and it burned part of the temple, and it burned through the rest of it on the next day. It's hard to say exactly what happened, but this fast is intended to commemorate that event. I saw an interesting article titled "The Death of Yeshua on Tisha B'Av" by Thomas Lancaster, and it was not actually. We know that Jesus died on the Passover, but there was a parallel that was given there that I thought was very interesting, and I want to talk about that. So just before the 9th of Av then, let's look at some of the parallels between the temple's destruction and Christ's death. And I just titled it "The Temple's Destruction and Christ's Death." So it's interesting, there's a passage in Isaiah, and you can turn over there for a second, Isaiah 66. According to one legend in the Talmud, the Messiah was born on Tisha B'Av, the same day the Romans destroyed the temple. But other opinions suggest the Messiah should have been born before the destruction of the temple. And it's based on this passage in Isaiah 66, 7 through 8. I find this very interesting. It says in Isaiah 66, 7 through 8, "Before she was in labor, she gave birth. Before her pain came, she delivered a male child, a boy. Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to give birth in one day, or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion was in labor, she gave birth to her children." Now, this is sort of a dual prophecy. It's looking at different times. It's ultimately looking ahead to the future and the bringing forth of the children of Zion spiritually, the church, I think, when we're actually changed into spirit beings at the return of Jesus Christ at this time of calamity that's going to come on the world, which actually this time of calamity to come on the world is actually called the birth pangs of the Messiah, according to the Jewish interpretation. But it's interesting that the way they look at this passage here, because some of the sages understood that this text indicated that the Messiah must have been born before the current exile began, because it says before she was in labor, she gave birth. It's like a reversal. Normally you have labor and then you give birth. And so they're saying this is talking about the birth of the Messiah, which would become before the labor. And actually I think there could be some truth in that as well, and that this was before all the travail of the end, the Messiah would be born into the world, which he was, by the way, we understand that. But this is an opinion in the Midrash Rabbah that says, before she travailed, she brought forth, means that before Titus was born, who the Roman general who brought the destruction on Jerusalem, the Messiah was born, which, by the way, is true. Targum Yonatan, which is a paraphrase of these passages, interprets the verse in a similar manner. It says, "Before distress comes upon her, she shall be redeemed, and before trembling comes on her, like the pains upon a woman in childbearing, her king shall be revealed." Now, a legend in the Jerusalem Talmud places the birth of Messiah on the same day as the destruction of the temple. That's not when it happens, but the idea is interesting because there's no other candidate for the Messiah that fits except for Jesus Christ, by the way. that would be this person who was born before the destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, there were some people later that made some claims to the throne or to be the king, the Messiah. But as far as this time frame, that really fits one person, and that is the one we understand to be the Messiah. Now, there's a Talmudic adage that this seems to fit with, which is, before God inflicts the wound, he creates the cure. So that is an interesting idea as well, that he already provided the solution, which he did. Actually, the solution was provided before the foundation of the world. You know, the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the world in an ultimate sense. God had that plan worked out. Now, remember something Jesus said that's very interesting. I've looked at, in John chapter 2, and I won't have you turn over there, but you know this passage, but it's where he told the Jews, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. And some people were claiming, he was advocating the destruction of the temple. That's not what he was saying. He didn't call for the destruction of the temple. He just said, if you destroy this temple, in 3 days I'll raise it up again. And it says right there, afterward, it says, but he spoke this of his body, which they would destroy. Now that's an interesting parallel, in that sense, that he was referring to his body as the temple, which of course it was, because the Holy Spirit dwelt within him. He was the Messiah. He was the Lord, the God of the universe, become flesh. He lived within that physical body. And so in that sense, it was a temple of God that was among them. The ultimate temple there, the spiritual temple in that sense, was in him at the time, which would be expanded later as he, more were joined to him spiritually, which we are to be. But it's interesting because he was actually, he was talking about himself, but there was a parallel with this destruction of the temple that would come. And in fact, later he even made this point when he was going to be crucified. He was saying, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves, and what's going to come upon this whole nation, and the destruction there of the temple that would come 40 years after his death and resurrection. But there's more than just one metaphor here. Jesus hints towards a spiritual connection between his physical body and the house of God. And let's remember, and I'll just reference for you Matthew 27:51 and Mark 15:38. That's where it says that when Jesus died at the moment of his death, the veil of the temple was rent from top to bottom. Ripped. It opened up. Now we understand there's a lot to that in the sense that his flesh, we later see it mentioned in the New Testament that the veil was rent, that is his flesh, and his flesh being rent was like the veil being torn to make open the way into the Holy of Holies. Spiritually speaking, that it was through Christ being killed, through his flesh being pierced and his blood being given, that the way was open to approach God directly in his temple. But it's interesting again that this was an infliction on his body as the temple of God. His body as the temple of God, as well as in the actual temple, that veil was ripped. But that was really more figurative. Where the veil was ripped in the temple was more figurative, whereas literally what happened was his flesh was ripped. And he, through that ripping of the flesh, made that way into approaching God directly. But it's interesting, I'd like you to turn over to Lamentations chapter 2. And this is something that's read at the time of Tisha B'Av, of the destruction of the temple, memorializing what happened. This was actually at the time of the Babylonian destruction, but of course this was prophetic of future destruction, not just at the time of the Romans, but ultimately in the future with the terrible time of trouble that's going to come on the whole world. Some of these things are going to repeat and actually become worse than they've ever been. But we look here in Lamentations 2, and we see in verses 6 through 7, it says, "The Lord has spurned his altar. He has abandoned his sanctuary. He has given up the walls of our palaces into the hand of the enemy." Now, I want you to think about that, because we're thinking about that as the physical temple. But think of it as the temple that was in the body of Jesus Christ, right? So it's in that same way. He's abandoned the sanctuary, given the walls of our palaces into the hand of the enemy. That happened. "They have made a noise in the house of the Lord, as on the day of a set feast. The Lord has purposed to destroy the walls of the daughter of Zion. He has stretched out a line. He has not withdrawn his hand from destroying. Therefore he has caused the rampart and wall to lament. They languished together." And so that's very interesting. Now this is from the Zohar, which is one of these Jewish texts of explaining certain passages of the scriptures. And this is from Zohar, Bereshit 161, commenting on Genesis. But it says, "Said Rabbi Yosei, what of the words, 'the Lord has done what he purposed,' here in Lamentations 2:17? Does a king purpose evil against his sons before they sin?" Rabbi Eliezer replied, "Imagine a king who possessed a precious vase, and who, being constantly apprehensive lest it should be broken, had it ever under his eyes and never lost sight of it for a moment. One day his son came and provoked him to anger, so that in his rage he took up the vase and broke it in pieces. In this way the Lord has done what he purposed. From the day when the temple was built, the Holy One, blessed be he, used to contemplate it fondly, and every time he came to the sanctuary, he used to put on the purple cloak we have mentioned. But when Israel sinned and provoked their king, the temple was destroyed, and the mantle was rent." So that's very interesting. Again, this idea that God had this protection over the temple, but then because of the people's sin, he basically gave it up in a destruction. And actually, I think about when Moses came down with the tablets, in Exodus 32, verse 19, Deuteronomy 9:17, he mentions this again. He had the tablets of the law of the temple, but he saw this outrage and he basically threw them down and it broke them. And that was, in a sense, that was the core of the temple, if you think about it. I mean, that was inside the Ark of the Covenant, as the Holy of Holies. So that interface between God and man was shattered, right? But it was for an ultimately right purpose, is when we think about it. Even the destruction of the temple, including especially the destruction of Christ's body as the temple, was to be an interface between God and man, but God actually had to allow that to be destroyed in a sense. I say destroyed, but ultimately we know he wasn't destroyed, but to be broken, as it were, to make the pathway between God and man. It's very kind of a profound way to think about this. There's another passage in Scripture in Isaiah 13 where it says that the light of the sun departed from the world, since it says in the verse that says the sun will be darkened at his going forth. And that, of course, is also prophetic of Christ. They think that would apply to the temple in one sense being destroyed, but also, of course, it applied to when Christ died. There was a darkness that came. And it's just very interesting that you think about, there was this darkness that yielded a good result, a positive ending, as awful as it was. So another note about this is that, and this to me is very interesting, is that they reckon it's for the sins of the nation that the temple was destroyed. The rabbis actually says, this is in, Barakot 3:8. It says, "Woe to the children on account of whose sins I destroyed my house and burnt my temple and exiled them among the nations of the world." The sages also saw the destruction of the temple, though, and this is really interesting, as a substitute, an atonement, so to speak, for the nation. The temple had not sinned. It did not incur God's wrath. The nation sinned, but God destroyed the temple in place of the nations so that he could spare his people. This is a quote from Exodus Rabbah 31:10. It says, "The Holy One, blessed be he, said, I have made a condition with them that if they sin, the temple will be seized and pledged. It is not because I am in debt to the heathen nations that I have pledged my tabernacle to them, but it is your iniquities that have caused me to hand my sanctuary over to them." So God, because of the sins of the people, gave the temple over to that destruction. But why? Because in a way they had a misplaced trust in the physical temple. They didn't understand. And I'll just reference for you Jeremiah 7, 4 through 15. Jeremiah 7, 4 through 15 is where God says the people were saying, well, the temple of the Lord are these. We have the temple, and because we have the temple, God won't allow the nation to be destroyed. And he says, but you're doing all these bad things. Am I going to let this go on? Look what happened to Shiloh, he says in that passage, where the tabernacle stood for hundreds of years. It didn't last because it had to be destroyed. Why? It had to be destroyed actually so that the people would not be comfortable and continuing in their evil ways. They actually had to have that broken to be able to be freed from their condition of sinfulness. And it's a little bit different with Christ. They didn't understand. They did have this idea that they would have the Messianic king and the Messiah would save them from destruction, but actually they ended up causing the destruction of their Messiah, which needed to happen to ultimately save them. It's pretty amazing the way God laid this out and planned it from the beginning. And here's another interesting thing. It says, the Midrash makes the relationship between the destruction of the temple and the atoning value of the death of the Messiah more explicit. It says this in Exodus Rabbah 35:4. This is quite a statement. Moses said to God, will not the time come when Israel, and now again, these are Jewish traditions, the way they explain this, but I just find this very interesting. It says, will not the time come when Israel shall have neither tabernacle nor temple? What will happen with them then? And it says, the Holy One, blessed be he, replied, I will then take one of their righteous men and retain him as a pledge on their behalf in order that I may pardon all their sins. And that is exactly what did happen, that God took not just one of their men, he was that, but the ultimate man, the ultimate God made flesh, the true Israelite, Jesus Christ, died on behalf of all. So, something to note here is that if we did not set aside time to mourn the destruction of the temple, we would forget it. It would become just a piece of historical information. The Jewish sages said, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to feel this. We're going to intentionally re-experience this sorrow every year. So they do that at this time of Tisha B'Av, they remember. But of course, that wasn't the ultimate picture. The ultimate picture was the death of Jesus Christ, that temple that was destroyed. And of course, we are to be joined to him, and all of us should, in that sense, die with him to be renewed, to be strengthened, to live again. It says in Zechariah 8, 18 through 19, that ultimately Tisha B'Av and these other feast days are going to become joy, gladness, and cheerful feasts for the house of Judah. So love, truth, and peace, that's the ultimate focus. The ultimate focus is there's going to be blessing and redemption through what happened. Even though it was a terrible tragedy and a terrible thing, but we could say the same thing about Christ. He died, and ultimately there's going to be redemption. And also God will allow suffering and death to overtake us, troubles that we experience, even as his spiritual temple, but ultimately for a future redemption. Have us turn over for our last passage to 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians 5. Because I think about this is what happened to Jesus Christ. This is what will happen to all of us as part of that temple. 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 5. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, this tabernacle that we dwell in, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Now he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has also given us the Spirit as a guarantee. And that Spirit is in us, and that makes us the temple of God. And because that makes us the temple of God, it says in Romans 8, if that Spirit dwells in us, then we will be quickened and changed into immortality at the return of Christ to live forever as the temple of God, enduring through eternity. It's an amazing picture. Just something to think about at this time of Tish B'Av as we recall the destruction of the physical temple.